Hello everyone. In this video, I would like to discuss with you all about a form of reasoning called abductive reasoning, or, as it is also referred to, inference to the best explanation. This is something that you probably do, but aren't aware of what it is called. With that said, let's get started. So let's first answer the main question: what exactly is abductive reasoning? Well, thankfully it has nothing to do with abducting anyone. However, in real-life abductions, this type of reasoning is used by detectives and law enforcement. In fact, even scientists use this form of reasoning. This reasoning attempts to provide the best explanation for how come something is true. This is why it is sometimes referred to as inference to the best explanation. However, this then raises the question, what is an explanation? To answer this question, I will refer back to the concept of an argument, which I have discussed in my previous videos. An argument is a set of statements where some of the statements, called premises, together provide support for believing another statement in the same set, called the conclusion. Explanations are similar in form, but instead they try to provide the best reason for how come something is the case, that is to say, true. For example, consider the claim, "I drank water." An argument for this claim would look like this. Premise 1, if you saw me drinking water, then I drank water. Premise 2, you saw me drinking water. Conclusion, I drank water. The goal of an argument is to provide a reason to believe something is true. In this case, I drank water. Now consider this. Here is the same claim, I drank water. However, this time I am providing an explanation for this claim. An explanation for this claim would look like this. Premise 1, I drank water. Premise 2, the best explanation for I drank water is I was very thirsty. Premise 3, the best explanation is probably true. Conclusion, I was very thirsty is probably true. The goal of an explanation is to provide the best reason for how come something is true. In this case, I drank water. This example illustrates the main differences between arguments and explanations. Here is a table that shows these differences regarding the goal, audience, premises, conclusion, and question to address. I'll let you read this table for yourself. In general, explanations are the result of abductive reasoning. As such, you can refer to explanations as abductive arguments. Here is the general form of an abductive argument. Premise 1, phenomenon X occurs. Premise 2, the best explanation for phenomenon X is explanation Y. Premise 3, the best explanation is probably true. Conclusion, explanation Y is probably true. Put another way, abductive reasoning occurs in 3 steps. First, you observe something. Second, you determine what the best explanation for that thing is. Finally, you conclude that this explanation is probably true. The first and third step are pretty easy. However, the second step is not so easy, and this is where the bulk of the work is done for abductive reasoning. However, to complete the second step, we first need to figure out how exactly do we determine what the best explanation for something is. How do we do that? Well, there isn't a set-in-stone rule to follow when determining the best explanation for something. However, there are some criteria that any good explanation should meet. The more of these criteria are met, the better the explanation. The best explanation is the one that best meets these criteria. Starting off with the first of these criteria, which is whether the explanation explains the phenomenon in question. This one is pretty obvious. Does it actually explain the phenomenon in question? The next criteria is being falsifiable. falsifiable means that it is actually possible to demonstrate that the explanation is false. For example, the statement, "all swans are white," is a falsifiable statement, meaning that it is possible to demonstrate that this statement is false by showing that there exists at least one swan that is not white. Even if we weren't able to show that this statement is false, it still would be a falsifiable statement because it is still possible to demonstrate that it is false. However, in this case, this statement is actually false because there exist black-colored swans. Again, falsifiable just means that it is possible to demonstrate that it is false, not that it is actually false. The third criteria is, does the explanation fit well with existing knowledge? In other words, can the explanation be derived from what we already know? The more it fits like a jigsaw puzzle piece with what we already know, the better. The fourth criteria is that the explanation makes very few assumptions. This is sometimes referred to as Occam's razor, which states that entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity. Put simply, pun intended, a simpler explanation that gets the job done is preferred. Finally, the fifth criteria is the scope of the explanation. The more an explanation can explain other phenomena that we know occur, the better the explanation. Here are the criteria in a tabular format. Notice that the first two, explains phenomenon and falsifiable, are just yes or no questions, whereas the rest are comparisons with other explanations. Given all of this, we could say that the best explanation is the one where reasoning pulls us towards the most. However, there is a downside to abductive reasoning. Remember how I said that the best explanation is probably true? This means that the best explanation may actually be false. In fact, sometimes the worst explanation we are aware of is the one that's correct. However, we wouldn't be aware of this. This is the downside to using this form of reasoning. We don't get absolute certainty. It is always possible that the explanation we claim is the best is actually false, even when all the evidence and reason points to it. This is due in part to the fact that we don't know everything, as the following example will show. Consider a typical court case that looks like this. John was caught running from the scene of the robbery. John was found to have in his possession jewelry from the shop that was burglarized. Witnesses saw John throw a brick into the jewelry shop window. The fingerprints on the brick matched those of John. Given all of this, the judge concluded that John was guilty of robbery. Or was he? Did the judge draw the correct conclusion? Well, if the judge drew an abductive reasoning conclusion, then the judge is on good grounds, as the conclusion explains the phenomena that has occurred, is falsifiable, fits well with our existing knowledge of human behavior, makes very few assumptions, and has a broad scope of explanation for the other pieces of information provided. This is normally sufficient in these matters. However, we cannot conclude that John was guilty with absolute certainty, for there is always the possibility of unknown evidence. For instance, John could have been set up. The witnesses were mistaken, and the brick was actually stolen earlier from John's house by a person unknown to the court. Think about stories, whether real or imaginary, where a person has been convicted on what seemed overwhelming evidence at the time, only to find evidence surface at a later date that brings the original conviction into doubt. Now, consider another example, a magic act. You are at a magic show, and a magician performs an act that amazes everybody, and no one is able to figure out how the magician performed the act. After the show, A random person from the audience claims that the magician has supernatural powers that allows the magician to defy all human limitations. This then raises the question, should you believe this just because no one else has an explanation as to how the magician was able to perform the act? Chances are, you probably said no. The reason for this is that the explanation provided isn't considered a good explanation in the first place. Even though the explanation would explain the phenomenon in question, it doesn't fit well with our existing knowledge, and it makes quite a huge assumption that people can have supernatural powers. This in turn would create a bigger mystery than the one you have. Therefore, this means that even if no one else has a better explanation for a given phenomenon, this doesn't mean that you should just believe whatever explanation is provided without first evaluating it to see if it is even a good explanation in the first place. An explanation must be good before it can be considered the best explanation. Perhaps, in the future, if more research is conducted, could a better explanation be provided? The last example brings up an important point. What if I can't think of any explanation for a given phenomenon? What do I do then? Sherlock Holmes once said, "When you have eliminated all which is impossible, then whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." The problem with this is, when do you know you have eliminated all other explanations? It may be the case that currently you nor anyone else may not have any other explanations, but that doesn't mean that all have been dismissed. Perhaps in the future another explanation will come about. Even then, whatever explanation is being provided still needs to first pass the test of being a good explanation. Therefore, sometimes, if all the explanations we are currently aware of don't fit these criteria well, then the intellectually honest thing to do is say, "I don't know." Putting everything that I have said together, I think a good way to understand is through a visual representation. On this slide, I have a diagram that showcases two categories of things and what is inside of them. In the blue circle are all possible explanations for a given phenomenon in question, and in the orange circle are all of the explanations for a given phenomenon we have evaluated. Notice that the orange circle is a subset of the blue circle. This means that all the explanations we have evaluated are part of all possible explanations. In these circles, you can find the following. In only the orange circle, you will find bad explanations, good explanations, and the best explanation. The reason why they are only found in the orange circle is because bad, good, and best are labels that are put on explanations by people. In other words, explanations only become bad, good, or best after someone has evaluated them. Also, there is only one best explanation at a given time. In only the blue circle, you will find explanations not evaluated yet. These are explanations we have not evaluated at all due to, in part, of not being aware of them or giving them much thought. Thus, they are not in the orange circle. Finally, there is the correct explanation that can be found anywhere. Just like the best explanation, there is only one, but it can be found anywhere. This is the explanation that is actually in accordance with reality. However, we just cannot know whether an explanation is the correct explanation, as we do not know everything since we have limited information, and unless all possible explanations are available, we don't know if the correct one is among our choices. Not to mention, being the best explanation does not guarantee it being the correct explanation. Now, consider this situation as we acquire more knowledge. As more knowledge is acquired, the orange circle gets bigger as we are becoming aware of more possible explanations and evaluating them. Notice also that the bad, good, and the best explanations can change, and The number of explanations not evaluated yet decreases because we are becoming aware of them and evaluating more possible explanations. Finally, we may evaluate the correct explanation if not already. So, what does all of this tell us? As we obtain more knowledge about the world, we increase our list of all explanations we have evaluated. Our evaluations of explanations can change over time. For example, good becomes bad and vice versa. The current best explanation may change. This is why falsifiability is necessary. Falsifiability enables us to determine if the explanation is false. Without it, this can be problematic if one believes in an unfalsifiable explanation, as they may unknowingly believe something false, and nothing can be done to demonstrate that it is false. We may never know if we have a complete list of all possible explanations to make our determination of the best explanation. Even when we believe we know the correct explanation, we may not truly know it's right. The best explanation can change over time, but the correct explanation stays the same. Therefore, the best we can do is figure out what the best explanation is given our current body of knowledge, accept it tentatively, and be open to revising it to better fit new knowledge that we obtain or replacing it with a better one. As a final note, we should also be very careful to the extent to which we rely on this form of reasoning, as the court case example shows. So that's abductive reasoning, or, as it is also referred to, inference to the best explanation. I hope now you have a better understanding of this form of reasoning that you probably do frequently in your life. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to let me know. With that said, take care and think critically.